Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of this lovely library, the Ashland Public Library, and this is our second horror mini fest. I am very excited for it, and I will introduce our guests in just a minute. I would like to thank a few people, the friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our adult programming, actually all of our. So triple thanks to them. And also my partners in crime here from the Framingham Library, John Garrigan and Lara. Yes. Who I just have a ball with doing all kinds of fun stuff like this. So we also have books for sale and signing from Aesop's Fable there. Andrew's out past the cookies. If you can get past the cookies, that's where he is. And the authors will be upstairs for signing after panel discussion, between discussion sessions. So, you'll be able to find them. So actually, I don't have bios for our authors, so I'm going to do this. Bracken, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Bracken MacLeod. You guys can hear me, right? Here. Oh, okay. We'll do this.
Feel more important.
Right, I know. I'm testing. I'm Bracken MacLeod. I'm the author of several books, the most recent of which is called Closing Costs. It's a Bayesian novel. Fun fact, I had written this novel called Stranded, which was set in the Arctic on an oil rig. And I wanted the next book I did to not have to do a ton of research because I had to do the same amount of research for that book. So I'm like, I'm just going to do a home invasion novel. I'm going to set up my own house. And then I don't have to do any hard, heavy lifting. And it turned out to be so much worse. I'm going to do the next one because it was pretty terrible. But it was too close, yeah. But the book is good. Anyways, that's me.
That one's all yours. That one's all yours. Yeah.
Hello. I'm also very loud, so there's a good chance you don't need this, but I think it's working. All right. Hello. I'm Victoria Dalpe. I write short and long fiction, and I'm also a teacher. And kind of dark stuff, often focusing on women and the body and the world. Where I operate and monster oriented. I'm just happy to be here, happy to be invited, and so glad to see all your faces. Glad you guys came out. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tom Rimner. I'm the author of 5 books, all set in Massachusetts. It's usually the inspiration for most of what I write. Usually, monster in your backyard kind of stuff. So in every one of my books, you can find a fictionalized version of a real place you can visit. Some really close to where we are right now. So happy to be here.
Doing all that back.
No. One does.
Thank you, everybody, for putting up with my lack of bios. As you might notice, Gretchen is not here. She's not able to make it today, and we're very sad about that. We'll have her back. It gives you guys more chances to answer all of our questions. So I have a bunch of questions, and then we'll go into a Q&A that you guys can ask, and then again, you can ask more questions later at the discussion sessions. So I'm just going to start off really basic. What drew you to writing horror? Why horror? Bracken.
Well, I have a theory. So I feel like horror is something that people love. I've done this before. No, I'm good. I'm trying not to put it up inside my shirt because I'm so moist. Which is, yeah, exactly. Which is usually how you do these things. But also, I wore my little brother's shirt today. So, anyways, I have a theory about this, which is that a lot of horror fans and creators don't necessarily gravitate toward horror as much as it's the safe place for them to be as outsiders. And then a lot of horror writers, I'll speak for myself, was kind of a weird kid with a lot of social issues. And when I found horror, it felt like a place where I could interact with all of my anxieties and all my fears in a very safe way, as opposed to the real world. I don't know. Maybe you just think it's cool.
Yeah, I think so. I would agree with that for sure. But I do think I spend a lot of time. I think also people are always surprised or they're like, "Oh, you write? What do you write?" Horror, and their face is very quickly oh, okay, I thought it was gonna be real, or or like super serious. And there's, there's a stigma attached to it. And one thing I always say is that you can get so much closer and so much more on it when you're using monsters and metaphors and fantastical scenarios. You can, I think, you can force people to be real, or you can put characters in extreme areas. That dog whistles. But you can get so much more real, and because you're not looking for that, in a straight drama, there's an expectation of normal, and it can kind of exceed that. You pull people out, and I think horror, there is a catharsis, and there's playing in more extreme spaces, and kind of seeing how people would get in and out of town, and what the world feels like when it is so unfriendly. And I think we've all experienced that in our lives, feeling, kind of lost, confused, out of control, scared, and this gives you that and amplifies it.
Do you feel like you have to work twice as hard? Because it was just online, like last week, there was the whole kerfuffle about women writing horror and how cozy horror is women's, right? Which was such a bunch of nonsense, given that the genre was pretty much invented by women, right? So.
Yeah. Well, hi, Frankenstein, and out stories that was women's fiction for a long time, and also, I don't know, there's just a lot of grotesqueries about this variation of a body. And I think that this idea that women haven't been consuming 50% of horror always, and been creating it alongside and being part of it, is just a misunderstanding. And I think it's a misunderstanding from like a more general population, and or those like awful guys that always make it look bad, like that just make everybody look bad when they're like, I have something to say. It's like, oh, that's the first guy. And I think there's just a misunderstanding, like that we've always been in it. We're often the ones who survive. We're often the ones that hear the bump of the knife and what listens to. And there's always been a space for women in the genre, and it's a weird misreading of it to kind of omit them. And the cozy thing is just like I could say, no offense, sorry. But I think it's just that was a weird way to not be about like the kind of extreme, like women haven't also been writing extreme horror and reading stuff as well. Anyway.
Oh, you just jumped to my question 15.
Right, I think horror found me at a really young age, probably younger than it should have. And I think I was attracted to horror because it was something I wasn't supposed to be interested in at a young age. I remember being in elementary school, and there was a specific rack, it was a spiral book rack in the elementary school library. I think at the time it was labeled like YA or something like that, as if that was, something forbidden that I should go near, that I should stay far away from. And I think it was for that reason, I took something off that bookshelf as like a fourth grader or something like that, and a librarian told me, no, that's not for you. You're too young for that. Ever since then, I couldn't stay away from it. And I think another reason that I love horror is the same reason I love roller coasters. I like being scared. I like the adrenaline that I get on a roller coaster, and I like the adrenaline and the feeling I get watching a scary movie, reading a scary book. And so I write what I myself like to ingest. So
there wasn't a YA when I was a kid, because I'm a fantastic old person. So it was pretty much I am. It was the Judy Blume to Stephen King pipeline, which exactly how yeah.
Read Stephen King in elementary school. Yeah, I did that. Great on the other half, or the dark half. It was like, why did they let me do that? So that's why it's funny, because I haven't read that book since I was literally, but yeah, I feel like everybody kind of jumped right into
Cujo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember there was a little bit of in between Judy Blume and Stephen King with like
Lois Young.
Yeah, Lois Young, Christopher Pike, and R.L. Stein.
So that was all improvised.
LJ Smith, some of those, the scary stories, some of those. I think there was a little bit of a psychotic, maybe.
So cool. So actually, although I have lots of questions, I'm going to go completely off track because our last horror class, we talked about the comfort of horror. Why do people find comfort in reading horror? And it really speaks to what you just said about, and Victoria, I think you said too, about you can feel safe there. Why? How can people feel safe in horror?
I think when you know something bad is going to happen, or it depends on the flavor of horror. If you're watching like a stalk and slash or you're reading something like that, it is kind of, it's not a, people are this way. It's like who, when, how elaborate will the scenario be? And usually there's a kind of the worst ones will get this elaborate death, and there's like the, you know, the theatricality of the violence of it, and that's part of your, like, the audience is playing a game as they're watching this. Like, will it scare them if they're anticipating a jump scare? Like, will it get them? Will they be very fun? I think there's an interactivity to horror as a genre that a lot of, you know, you don't necessarily need with other genres. You know, that there was like roller coaster, there's a participatory like experience to it. I guess weepy, I would say like sad movies that everyone cries would probably be the equal one of that.
Why do you like sad?
Yeah, like, just like have an ugly cry, like that'd be like a sob situation. Like, why would you do that? I don't know. I think it's just finding a way to clean those feelings out of your body without having to go live that in blood.
I think, you know, I think it can also be a safe rehearsal. And, you know, we all, I mean, with the exception of Eric Nunley back there, who's immortal, you know, we're all going to die someday. And the idea is that in horror, you can sort of rehearse mortality in a very safe way. You can look at what scares you, what's threatening, what might be deadly, but when it becomes too much, it's so fun, right? And so you can take it bits and pieces as needed and sort of have a way of coping with our children.
I disagree.
You're wrong.
Put down. Tom, do you have?
For me, there is something comforting in horror that it feels in a lot of ways further away from reality than watching, you know, a drama. Like right now I'm watching on Hulu Dope Sick, which is about the opioid epidemic, and that I find myself cringing and looking away from television, whereas like I put on a horror movie and fall asleep. And I think there's something about the familiarity and me knowing this is as far from real as I probably will ever experience.
I mean, yeah, there's a level of intensity. You know, I can watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre anytime, any day, but I've only watched the top. You know, but I can't go back and rewatch the Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, I think like 3 episodes of that.
It's one of my favorite books. It's really faithful to the book. True enough, yeah.
I wouldn't be reading that right now anyways.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, yeah, like a straight drama, a lot of times I do not have, it bums me out. I don't just, like, you can just go experience, but I don't know if I need to be playing in my free time by also being kind of depressed by how depressing things are. You know, it just doesn't.
Well, as far as mediating experience, right? The fantastical about it is what's in between us.
Yeah.
Right? Unless you're writing something like Michael, which is completely real world based.
But then you're haunted forever.
But then you're haunted forever, and that's the live in that you spend.
Yeah.
You know, you wrote it.
It's not it's your fault.
It is. I voiced by my own guitar.
And I wouldn't be going to Tom's backyard either. Okay, so the actual topic of this conversation is the intersection of character building and world building, character development and world building. And so the question is, what comes first for you? Character, world, and actually John had this addition, is plot. What comes first to you in terms of what you're going to write or into your head? Like, oh my God, that person, I have to write about them. So I'm going to start with you.
Definitely world for me. You know, as I said, I'm writing stories that literally everything I've read so far say makes sense. So I like knowing where the story is. I like that I can, you know, visit a place I'm going to write about while I'm writing about it. And so I think I have that framework before I do anything else. And then I go into story and characters.
Characters last.
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
And that doubles. Totally character first. I think I'm not a super plot heavy writer in general. I'm definitely much more mood focused, I think a lot of times, or moment focused. And yeah, I think my entrance into a story is through the character and then how they see and perceive their world. I do tend to be drawn to kind of outsider characters or things suddenly feeling out of sync or unsafe. And so I feel like so much of that is based on who's looking out, because every person's going to have a very different reality and how they kind of experience it. So I definitely think I'd start character first and then move out from there like a ripple.
Okay.
And I 100% start with character.
Mhm.
I'm most interested in people and emotions, and so I start with, these are people that I feel like I could spend the next 6 months and 400 pages with writing. And then the next step is, how badly can I fuck up their lives? Right. So, the next step is plot. And then setting is sort of I think for me is an element of plot. Because their surroundings should be a part of the drama, or whether it's a haunted ship in the Arctic or a suburban or quiet suburban. It's always part of the problem.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so it is, a little bit of a flip for me. Like I like to know what terrible place and terrible things gonna happen, and then pick out the poor souls that I get to drop in.
Okay, so I think everybody wants to know this. Are you a plotter or a pantser? I mean, does it pop into your head and you start writing, or do you have to have a huge outline before you can do anything?
I'm an incredibly disordered person, and so I need absolute order in my writing. Well, the problem is, I started before I was a writer, I was a litigator, and so I would prepare for a trial. And the thing about a trial is you never ask a question you don't already know the answer to, right? And so I would create like a litigation binder. So tab A is my opening statement, tab B is the first witness, tab C is the second witness, all of that throughout. And that's how I write a book. I write a litigation binder for the book. I have all my characters' profiles. I know everything about, I know what they drive, I know how long their fingernails are, and all details that don't matter, that might not ever come up in the story. But they matter to me because it helps me go, oh, this is a person who's fastidious about their appearance. So they're going to make choices based on it, right? So the details I know. And then tab B is the inciting incident, tab C is the next step. And the reason that works for me is because I'm so much more interested in emotion and reaction, like how those people feel about what's happening to them, that trying to decide what's happening to them is an impediment to my real goal as a writer.
Wow. Okay.
I was gonna say I'm 100% blocker. I will plan everything out from by chapter, to what some of the actual dialogue is in the chapter before I start really fleshing it out. Right? And if I try to go off the seat of my pants, I'll never finish. I will never get through a book if I was to just.
I tried it once and it was an abject failure. Like I went on so many like garden paths and little, things, and had a cast of thousands. And suddenly I realized like this is just meandering, wheel spinning, and I need an hour.
Well, I mean, that's the Stephen King model, which is why it's so big and there's so many people that are like, well, do we ever know everything? And then by the end, he's like, oh, here's the end. And then it'd be like, pages. It's like, it's 1,200 pages to get. He's like, I was my way. Right. So that is, that kind of cautionary / tale of like doing it. Yeah, I'm a plotter really. I usually do what I call checkpoints and have a rough idea or a really concrete idea of how I want it to end. And then there are certain checkpoints that need to happen to move the story toward that endpoint. And then I leave myself a lot of space for how to get there so that I can kind of surprise myself or tell myself the story. If I over outline, I don't write it because I feel like I already told myself the story and I feel like the work was done. Even for the new book I'm writing, and I had to kind of do a presentation for the outline, and I outlined so much that I was like, And I just started writing it, and I was like, well, I just banged out like 12,000 words. You want to see that instead? I just started. I don't want to getting like, and not having any fun with it. So I tend to kind of create set pieces and characters and scenarios as I feel like I need them. With this idea that then I'll get like checkpoint and then you to the next thing, and so those things are all happening. So as long as those are happening, how I get there. That said, I have a billion started and unfinished things because I will reach that choose your own adventure path and not be able to commit to one and then be like, I'm bored, and then just and those I do dig into those later when I'm looking for something or to be re-inspired. I'll go through those and pick them up again.
Analyze those.
Yeah, I'll pick them up. Sometimes years later when I had no memory of it, it's like this. And just pick it up again. So they do exist in a realm of the story. But yeah, that is the downside of not being a blogger.
The funny thing about your Stephen King, is that he's actually really snarky about outliners. And I can't remember his exact line. It's something like, people who outline books are failed MFA students who wish that they could be artists, and I'm just like, that's nasty, because the very best book you ever wrote, in my opinion, is The Dead Zone. It's the only one you ever outlined.
Okay, then. So what would you say for you? I guess so for all of you though, you kind of know where you're going, regardless of if plot or can. Okay. So what is harder for you to write and easier? Character or world, plot, setting, mood, vibe. What is the easiest and hardest thing for you to write? Tom?
I would say what's easiest for me to write is probably the plot. Like books tend to really move and fly, a lot of action. Most comfortable writing scenes that there's a lot. I think I struggle more, even though I start with it. I think one of my faults, very aware of, is that since I'm writing in places that are real, sometimes I forget that the reader may not have been to the places I'm talking about. And so I end up going back and really having to flesh out the places I'm writing about. But I would say plot is definitely, I think is useful.
I would agree with that. I feel pretty judgmental right now.
Well, yeah, for me, it's character. I have the most fun with character, and I guess I'm a horror writer on the surface who wishes he could do literary, because I just love to sit in a room with two people who are clashing with different emotions and having experiences. I want their interiority to drive the reader's interest in the book and not necessarily just what's happening. Although most of my books are really propulsive and they kick off on like the third page of some unimaginable act of violence, and then it's off to the races. But I'm always most interested in and inspired by the people.
Can you say that interiority word again?
Interiority. Yeah, I want their interiority. I want you to feel what they're like.
Oh, I see their internal. Yeah, who they are inside.
They're thieves.
Oh, excellent. Cute, yeah. Also drop the other F word too, nice. Okay, Victoria. I don't remember what the question.
It was
Like,
we're looking at like plot, character, or setting.
the easiest thing to mean.
Did we move on?
Easiest or hardest?
Oh, easiest or hard.
Thank you.
Yeah, for action scenes, and I'm going to try in this new thing I'm working on because I love reading action scenes, but tend to not. I think I'm just a classic graveyard goth kid at the end, so I'm all about mood, so it's much more like, no, but what does it smell like in there? Like, just love to kind of get in there, and I think set a tone. And so I think sometimes it's like, okay, I don't know if people care this much about the paper. We probably should kill someone or get chased or something should happen besides just quiet dread, like that keyboard note. Just
If Elizabeth Perkins Gilman ever said that to herself, we would have one of the best horror stories we've ever had. I don't know if people care this much about the yellow wallpaper.
they still do it for here, but they do. Like it's foundational, whether you know it or it's important. But yeah, so I think there's something to be said for that kind of quiet, weird fiction that you're like, oh, this is very unsettling and nothing is happening, but I'm not having a good time. And I think that that kind of dread note is a place I like to be. But I wish I was more action oriented. So I'll try to do more running, chasing.
Write a lot of running and chasing, but I prefer to read. Move.
Interesting. Okay. Well, so that actually brings me to another question that's not on my list. Is so how do you choose to do that? Like, how do you choose to be more action oriented versus mood oriented? Like, so some people, of course, as readers, it's gonna happen. It's gothic, and then there's like the sort of action scene. Somebody's constantly getting their head chopped off. So, what makes you choose one over the other, or is it a choice? Is it a mix?
I mean, I like to read stuff that moves, so I like stuff that moves. I think I get really impatient and I need to move. I run a lot from different perspectives and POVs, so I really like to want to know what the other person's looking at and thinking. So I think it's just a personal preference. I like to read that.
Yeah, mood, I read all across that gamut, so it's very much like what I'm in the mood to, like where I want to be in reading. So sometimes I am like doomy, dreary spaces, and other times I want like chasing or something a little funnier or lighter, you know, so it kind of depends. And I think mood wise when writing, that's the same thing. And I think sometimes you can try to play around with your voice, but I think as you write more and more, you start to have a thing. And that's why people like writers and keep reading the same writers, because they like, even if their plots are different, there's something about them that they're connecting with. And, you know, and sometimes you'll read something by a writer who's read a lot, and it's a totally left field, and you're like, whoa, it's kind of like when a musician does like a really experimental album, and, you know, sometimes it works for you, and sometimes you're like, prefer more Freebirds. Like, you know, that idea of like, just do the hits. This is weird. So I think, you know, I think we do fall into a style and a preference in writing. Like for a long time, I was trying to be so serious, and people would read stuff and they're like, oh, that was really funny. You know, like I would get laughs when I was reading stuff out loud, or like a Valley Girl default, or like in speaking patterns, like, oh, this is supposed to be serious, and then I get laughs. And I really realized that I tend to be funnier than I am trying to be so serious. Like I end up being funny. And so I just have to like be okay with that it might just be a little funnier than I was intending, even if it's supposed to be so. And so that's something I often struggle with.
Bracken.
Okay, so I went off script on the last question. Repeat the question for me.
What was it?
What is it like?
Strengths and weaknesses. What do you like?
No. Is it what's easy to write?
What's hard to
Right.
Oh, well, none of it's easy.
It seems so easy though. Like when we read it as a from a reader's perspective.
But that's it. Yeah, that's the idea. That's the end goal. Is that when you read it, it should feel effortless, right? When you see a movie, it shouldn't feel like 1,500 people worked on it. It should feel like you're in the world, and that's exactly how a book goes. It shouldn't feel like I spent 9 months agonizing over whether to use the word interiority or fifis, but I agonize over it, and I don't move on to the next sentence. So this one is perfect, but for the reader, you should be able to glide over those sentences and feel continuity. And so, you know, that's probably the hardest thing for me is maintaining a feeling throughout the book, because the craft of writing a book is not as propulsive as reading, right? And so maintaining suspense and maintaining action are really difficult things to do over the course of weeks and months. And depending on the writer, sometimes years, you know. And I think that's why I prefer to stick in emotional spaces with characters, because I can, just thinking who I am, I can maintain a negative emotional mood indefinitely. But excitement is kind of hard. I can be bummed out all the time. But, you know, getting excited and going out and doing something, that's really fun. So.
Wow, that's really I feel like we're in a therapy session.
Kind of horror writer retreat on the conference, kind of been running down. The people who are kind of doing their therapy work tend to be the horror section, you know, just in general, because you're mucking around in your kind of personal experience and things you're afraid of, but like horror and comedy, there's a reason they kind of share that same point, and it's that there actually is a surprising amount of empathy in both of those genres, because it's not about what scares you necessarily, it's what scares somebody else, or it's not about what you think is funny, it's trying to intuit what somebody else would think is funny or scary. So it's much more about understanding that someone else is looking at what you're working on and then having this dialogue. And I think that sometimes it's forgotten about. Like if it's effective, that actually means that they know who's reading this and finding a way to communicate something with someone else and succeeding.
Right. Victoria's point is exactly right. Like horror and comedy are two sides of the same coin because they're both based on empathy. They're both based on timing. Yeah, futility. I was going to say transgression. Horror and comedy are both based on transgression. What makes a good joke is that the punchline's unexpected, right? But reveals some kind of truth that you don't really want to acknowledge. You know, that's good comedy. And horror is transgressive. It makes you feel uncomfortable in the moment because it's not where you thought you were going to be, but now it is where you reside, right?
So standard in horror movies is the like 1-2 punch where it's like it's built up, you get a jump, it's a cat or whatever. And then something scary happens, so people laugh and then they scream again, you get the double whammy is like a really like animal. And you know, like it's so like horror movies love to it, or they'll even do it a couple times. They'll keep doing it. Okay, you're always waiting for the big one. Okay, one of these is gotta be real. So like playing around with that, and then people often like scream and then laugh. You know, they're like embarrassed. I got that. So
That's sweet. So Tom, do you have a thought about this whole group therapy thing?
you have time.
Tell us about your mother.
No, I agree with what Victoria said, you know, having been to, been around a lot of horror people. I think a lot of this is very therapeutic for the author, for the reader. So, yeah.
Thank you. So interestingly, John gave me this question, which you all are welcome to type in on because it's an interesting one. That empathy is what makes horror work much of the time. So why do we think of it as it's often ignored by people outside the genre when they're trying to examine or criticize it? Why is it poo-pooed? A lot of people like put it down. So awesome.
Like there's kind of there's a perception that it is a like a lower genre category, and this idea that it's exploitative or that it's just like excessive for the sake of being excessive. I think follow that around, but then you look at kind of a true crime and thrillers and how grisly all of those are, or how exploitative to like real people, and those be totally acceptable, but then fake people that is there's actually a strangeness sometimes to I think it's overall perception that is I think a patent misunderstanding genre, and like often it shows they really haven't waded very far into it because there is plenty of women on meat hooks, but there's also a lot of things.
I mean, I think the thing about it is that the genre doesn't do itself any favors. Especially when you look at, I'll talk about cinema for a minute because I don't think you can necessarily talk about people's engagement with horror without starting with cinema. It's like most accessible, but Friday the 13th Part 8, which I'm a fan of, and my son absolutely adores, but it's not a really deep story with a lot of empathy, right? It's a lot of fun, but it's not quite like Paul Tremblay levels of nuance and emotion, and so when people are looking for something, of course, the most visible stuff is the popcorn, and the popcorn stuff, and getting really nuanced work, you have to dig deep, and I'm not sure that everybody wants to do that work.
Corgi is
Oh. Don't shoot that, not porky. Well, yeah, right. There's American Pie and there's Hugh Grant movies, right? And they're completely different.
And, you know, there's just a lot of different things. Like, all right, what was this? This is like that morning talking. Sometimes it's 4 a.m. and that is it's the porky. That's the porky.
But I think the food analogy is great. Because I think that a lot of people grow into food tastes and, you know, they start being picky eaters and they expand their palate. And that's exactly how I think art is for a lot of people. They dip their toe into something comfortable, quiet, and then they try a little bit more and try a little bit more. And it can, and if they find themselves a fan of the genre at all, they suddenly find themselves a
Right. I have a follow-up question, but I want to hear from Tom first.
I just think, you know, nowadays, there's even less of an excuse to not be able to find the more nuanced things. You know, when Friday the 13th Part 8 came out, you know, that was the most visible, the most accessible, you know, form in a lot of ways, other than CD itself. Now, like, I kind of like to think that we're in the middle of this horror renaissance, and there's so many new voices out there, and it's so much easier to find and hear those voices. So, you know, I think it's a shame that people sometimes, you know, put a certain label on horror. Although a lot of times I like some of those labels. Some horror, you know, it can be nuanced. It also can be quite.
You know, it's
Which one is it?
which one is it? Thank you. That's actually see. Jason Takes Manhattan is the worst of the series. Like Jason X is a critical. Oh man, that's 10. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's pretty bad. By the way, that's my son, the resident expert on all things.
There and now. There's that.
But I think to your point, you're absolutely right. We're living at an absolutely wonderful time for horror between, you know, writers like Paul Tremblay and studios like A24 that are making really intelligent, deeply moving works of horror. It's a good time for the genre.
Big slide forward to the cozy horror being coded as, you know, feminine or like wigs or whatever that whole thing was. In the same way that elevated horror or literary horror get trotted out for things, but no, you guys read this. It's literary horror. It's not for them, it's for you. It's for like sophisticated kids and adults. And even the way when, you know, like Times like does a write up on a horror times and they're very like, well, this one is forever. You know, that there's a tone when it breaks through, and A24's entire brand is kind of built on being like, but we're already. So it's like this too. And this idea that there's.
And yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. You know, it happens on both sides of the continuum where outsiders give us labels, you know, impose labels on the genre. So the elevated horror thing really tweaks a lot of people badly because they hate the snobbery, the idea, well, this horror is plebeian, but this is good stuff. Like, yeah, by the same token, like there was a whole thing in the 90s, early aughts about torture porn. Right. And torture porn was not a term that we came up with. It was a term that the squares came up with to dismiss what we were doing. But writers who are often, self-loathing and, you know, willing to grab any, you know, sort of like they would think, they're just like, yeah, oh, torture porn, I hate that stuff. It's like you're not talking about what you do. You're just using the squares term to dismiss it. And so, yeah, elevated horror, torture porn, they all go in the same trash bucket of nonsense that's meant to make you feel good about whatever it's for. Consumer.
As a romance reader, I know that people call it mommy porn, so same thing. So
I mean, porn too, it's different.
I'm gonna have to check into that. Sounds like the best of all worlds.
Maybe.
Okay. Okay, so show of hands, how many of you Do not tell people that you read horror. Awesome. How many of you have ever been denigrated for saying that you read horror? I hate those people. Okay, so, it's a thing. People, so the follow-up question was really like, who makes these decisions? Who decides something is literary horror versus trash horror, or what was it? Terror?
Torture porn.
Torture, right, all the way to the bottom. Who decides that? What, you said New York Times. Is that our barometer for choosing if something is high lit?
You got the bestsellers about, and I think it also comes from kind of a high school English class, kind of like canonized things that are in best of, or, the, paramount of literature, and then it's like, and then the other stuff. And I think, often, all the bookstore model of like literature, and then you have your genres in different things. Whereas when you walk around in those, you could very easily, go upstairs, we could do this together. You'll be like, oh, but this one it takes place in the Old West. Like, could this be Western? Or like this one is just choking and spew or Handmaid's Tale. Like, listen, this, couldn't we put this into sci-fi fantasy? Or like, once you start playing with that, the genres fall apart. Right? Because unless it's like bog standard human drama in a house, which most of it, like someone's an alcoholic or something.
Well, and if it's a woman in it, it's women's fiction.
Right. Fiction, it's just like if she just wanders through or has a lead, it's like you go with fiction. Like there's some really weirdness in most stories that some sort of love story and then a relationship. So it's all be romances in some way. Like if you stay together or get together as a book, aren't you a romance in a way? So I think it's just a way that we have had things that aren't really, I don't know, accurate. And but there is stigma.
I think sometimes the problem is that the people who are reviewing horror books and horror movies are sometimes people who don't read a lot of horror, or don't watch a lot of horror movies. So they'll label things, as literary horror. But I think the people who I would like to see reviewing horror novels and reviewing horror movies are people who love those things and watch a wide range and read and ingest a wide range. I think we get better stuff.
I agree.
I mean, all of these genres are sort of are permeable with each other, right? And and it's the famous quote. I think it was Doug Winter. Horror is a genre. It's a feeling. It's a state of mind, and so you can have horror. Well, and you do horror Western and horror. Science fiction horror, alien, right? Is a haunted house movie in space, and and all of that, and so I don't think that that horror as a genre necessarily is in a two-type box, like it fits in. But as a sort of cultural touchstone, I don't think it's received the kind of respect that like science fiction has, right?
And if you talk to somebody who writes science fiction, they're like, oh, nobody ever respects that.
Yeah, right. Well, you think about like the Lions of the Canon, Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury, and they were writing literary work that was taken seriously. And and the same thing hasn't happened for horror. We haven't seen that kind of like uptick of, oh, that's not just a good horror novel, that's just a great novel. Now, I think it has happened.
200 years. So like look at all the Victorian Gothic.
Exactly.
And so just like with a little time comparison.
But
Daphne du Maurier.
And but I think sometimes it happens and people don't want to admit, like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian is a horror novel. It's just a straight up horror novel. But it's the great American novel, and so it's a Western, it's literary, it's all this stuff that nobody wants to kind of put in that section.
See that somebody can make that decision and affect the ability of the book to sell too, because people are less likely to buy something that is mommy porn or torture porn or something than something that's literary, right?
Yeah, well, that was it. I mean, Cormac McCarthy barely sold like 2,500 copies of any book he ever wrote until All the Pretty Horses. Became a literary sensation. I mean, he had written books about incestuous cannibals and mass murder in the American West, and all of these genre novels that have a literary voice. But it wasn't until he did the straight up literary novel that they could make a movie with Matt Damon that he suddenly became super.
Got it. All right. So we do have some time for some questions. I mean, I have plenty more. Thank you for this.
Just gonna run around with the mic to,
That's loud. So you don't need that. It's apathetic porn. Porn, sure.
Scratch.
Or that we're going to see more of a rise in people reading it and consuming it. I think it's like you said when you were reading YA 10 years old. YA is having a moment of horror right now. And I think that it's snagging those kids and telling them it's okay now.
and those readers can grow up.
Yeah.
And it's gonna keep reading.
Because that was me. I started at 10 years old reading it. I got shamed for it, but now I'm okay with it. So I'm teaching my children, dude, you can read whatever you want. It's okay. So I think that empathetic horror is going to have a moment in like 10 years. I'm like predicting this because YA horror is right now.
Excited for that, and it's much is gonna be there for them to read. You're like, oh, are you ready?
And the thing that what's being written now, like Gretchen, for instance, there's such a voice, and you can say it, and it's accepted, and it's not like no. I just think it's awesome, and I just wanted to say that because I love like Paul Tremblay. I cried for this. So, which it's horror. Who cries to horror? He's made me cry. Like it's like yeah, feeling. So I think there's going to be a rise.
No, see, I really wish you had talked into the mic so that we could pick that up on the recording. So it's,
And that's what we used to say in litigations is, you know, you'd ask a question, someone would nod. It'd be like, your answer has to be audible for the court reporter.
Be in the other room.
you know, I just want to make sure that in 10 years we can come back to this recording and be like, oh, yeah.
Seeing it. Yeah. YA horror is insane right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder why. Hey.
Stop. I think it's just when it's acceptable and you can get it.
I mean, I think also changing. We're more accepting now than we were 15, 20 years ago.
A lot of unrest right now, and there's a lot of, if you look at data, like longer term data patterns, horror usually kind of comes up when there's a lot of unrest and certain specific type of things are happening. Then there's usually, I think for that catharsis, there's a desire to kind of purge yourself of some of that anxiety through, you know, kind of reading about it, experiencing it, watching things that are not necessarily lived experience. It kind of goes against the idea that if things are rough, you would want to read stuff that's rough. But I think there's a desire to kind of burn off some of that pressure and that anxiety. And so,
Well, I mean, yeah, that's.
Horror's been really like very close to be sort of like reaching the surface and being visible to the masses for a little while now. I mean, a few years ago, I think the Shape of Water won Best Picture.
which a lot of people have
John Five or so you're starting to see movies, you know, the horror films or adjacent films being taken more seriously. With a number of horror authors out there now, they're starting to be seen as, you know, rightfully more legitimate authors as they always should.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly why now, but it's been sort of building.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wish I could predict the future. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know a single thing about YA fiction. I do read it, right? I don't write it.
Mm-hmm.
It you know, it reminds me, there's a funny story of Mo Willems before he was Mo Willems, like Don't Let Pigeons Drive the Bus. Wrote for Sesame Street, right? And when he got the gig writing for Sesame Street, he was a comedian before, and they interviewed him, and he's like, I don't know how to write for kids. And they're like, but you're funny. We can't teach you how to be funny, but we can teach you how to write for kids. And I feel like that's kind of like horror. Like we can't teach you how to be scary, but we can teach you how to write scary, right? And so I think there's an element of it that's. I mean, this is not your question; it's a completely different topic. But trends and why horror is ascendant, and I think it's because there are a lot of people in the genre right now who get it and are capable of doing it. And they're doing it in many different ways. There's not just one vehicle to get it. There's YA horror, there's fully adult horror, there's the stuff that like Gretchen and Eric LaRocca are writing, which is also great stuff. Paul, I keep mentioning Paul, Victoria are writing really literary, elevated material. And, yeah. But I mean, it's you know, it's cross media, and I think the fact that people are able to find the one that fits their taste is making it more accessible, because it's not just Stephen King, it's not just like there's only Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Now there's, you know, broad range depending on what your thing is. And if you're not really into splatter punk, then you know, then you move in a different direction and do something that's a little bit safer for you.
Felt like a moment of like a grab the microphone. I think part of it also is the legitimizing of just like nerd culture becoming mainstream culture, which I think, you know, the idea of being like, I'm so alternative, I like manga. I was like, that's not so mainstream. Like all superheroes are mainstream, comic books are mainstream, horror movies are mainstream. It's none of this is subversive anymore. And even like by having like, again, Eric LaRocca's like, you know, the times, like, you know, we're there. It's, you know, it's all been kind of mainstreamed, and these are not sub groups anymore. These are very much in the front. And so I think we're bringing an identity of the kind of outsider milling around hot topics and alleys. But I mean, it's much more the kind of standard model. I think being someone who reads dark stuff, or I mean, think about like how much money Megan made, you know, or like, you know, and you know, just the Blumhouse machine and everything. Like the horror is deeply mainstream, and but I think it still wears a badge of being an outsider, but it's very much an insider. And I mean, there's a temptation to kind of actually, because you know, if you look at 50s monster movies, you know, these were not hidden away. These were, everyone was just going to movies to see. And, you know, if you think about the 70s and kind of Rosemary's Baby, and there's a lot of, you know, again, Jaws 78?
Yeah.
It's Jaws is 40 years, like last week.
Wow.
Well, 41, so yeah, it's like so wow. But yeah, so I mean, and that was the beginning of that kind of blockbuster monster movie, was that Spielberg model. But you know, you think about Alien, and I mean, these were existing, and they were mainstream. The Shining, you know, and a lot of them, they maybe weren't big hits when they came out. Actually, a lot of them, like The Thing and things, were not. But they, a lot of their shadows are long, and they're super popular now, and they have a cult history, and they just continue to be popular. And so, yeah, like I think there has been a mainstreaming to this all along, that the narrative doesn't. I mean, think about how many books sells. Like, think about how popular these are. The mainstream.
There's a funny thing about Stephen King in particular, which is that you run into a lot of people who are like, I don't like horror.
I don't.
I read Stephen King. You know, it's like, you know, and the disconnect there. It's like almost all of his work, with few exceptions, is horror in some way or another. But you know, I don't like horror. I just read Stephen King, or you know, I'm not.
True crime podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I don't really like horror movies, but Silence of the Lambs is my favorite film. Right? I think it's people who are horror fans but aren't willing to admit it because of.
My dad saw it.
Well, that's what they slapped on the cover of my new book. Is a novel of suspense.
Dad's great.
I gotta even cut each other's faces open. It's like it's a suspense, you know.
So we have time for one last question, and I'm going to ask it. So do you think that because of this sort of lack of respect that all of us changed, that there's been a greater rise in self-publishing in horror because of the lack of respect that has gotten up till now? Because in 10 years it's going to continue.
Well, going great.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Over the course of my career, I've seen exactly this happen, which is when I first got my agent, you know, I sent him a thriller, and I said, the next book I want to do a horror novel, and he's like, you're a really good thriller writer. I want to throw, we just sold this, we want to throw it. Okay. And in the intervening years of writing thrillers, now my agent is like, yeah, he's not a horror writer, he should be writing horror. He's not looking at my development as a writer, he's looking at the market, right? And what he can sell. And I love Howard to death. He's absolutely right on both accounts of a good thriller writer and a great seller. Both my Keith and Sell in the Moment is based on how the trends are going. When I started publishing, working with him, horror was indie, was small press and self-published, because those were the people who were really willing to take big risks with work. And the big five at the time, now the big four publishers, don't necessarily want to take giant risks. Although now they are, like, Gretchen's book, Manhunt, is from Tor, or Macmillan, and it's, and that's, I can't imagine that book being published 10 years ago by a mainstream publisher. It would have been a small press book. So,
It's always kind of shifting. But I think the people stay kind of in the small, because you can do what you want and you don't have to write to market. And I think that is very attractive. I mean, for myself, include just where you don't trying to do anything because it'll sell. You're just writing because you want to write the story that you want to write. And it's harder to get to the people that you want to read it. But I think there's an authenticity to when you're writing because you just felt like writing that kind of a story versus you are writing because you have a 3-book deal and you will lose your representation if it doesn't do the numbers that the previous book did. And now whatever you came up with first is kind of out of style. And so you're going to need to pivot to kind of fit the new style, which is the reality of the more mainstream big book markets, which is why you kind of get a little bit of a sameness or just kind of a wave of a certain style of book, and then it'll go out of the way. So you get, there's pros and cons, I think, to both of them.
I think there also is, wonderfully, there's less of a stigma now around indie publishing, around small presses, self-publishing. But I think it really is, the perfect time for, because so much of this is so accessible now. It's really easy. It's a lot easier than it would have been to find, a lesser known author today than it would have been 10 years ago. So I think it's just, as I said before, sort of a horror renaissance, an indie renaissance, and it's just really cool to be.
So I lied. I can't end on such a serious note. And I know Victoria's totally here. So I would like to know, what is the scariest thing you've ever written and scared you or read? Or read. The scariest thing.
I'll start. So the scariest thing I've ever read was a book. It was Dalton Trumbo's John and Battle's Gun. It's a book about a guy in World War II who's decelerated, and so he's just basically he's living consciousness. He has can't see, can't speak, can't hear, can't move. He's only just in his head, imagining what's happening to his body, and it was absolutely terrifying. I had to put the book down twice while reading it because his imagination went to such dark places, and he had no idea what was really happening. And the scariest thing I ever wrote, I try to write things that scare me because I feel like if I want you to feel it when you look at the page, I feel it sitting at the keyboard. And so, the scariest things that I've ever written are things that I fear, like losing a child. I wrote a book called Come to Dust, where in the first chapter a little girl dies. She comes back. Spoiler. But that was a hard scene to write, and it wasn't a supernatural horror scene. It was an absolute distillation of my worst fear at the time I was writing it. My son was very little, and yeah, I had to take a break and stop.
Yep, you just reminded me actually of one of the things that I read in it. My grandmother was really into medical horror and like sleazy pervert doctors, like her jam. And yeah, and like sorority horror. That's a whole other.
Family sounds fascinating.
weirdo horror people who all have different flavors of what they like. But so I read a lot of Robin Cook as a kid because she just had tons of it at her house. And there was one story, and I always thought it was in Coma, but I think it's actually in Brain, which would make sense for what I'm going to say next, where a lady wakes up, but it's actually she's just a brain in a jar, and she didn't realize she's a brain in a jar. And the doctor kind of controls her from going insane by pushing this button, which gives her a simulated orgasm. And the only way that, and he just like, whenever she's upset or starting to freak out, he's like pushing the button all the time. And I remember being like 8 and being like, yeah, I like still think about it. Anytime she started to be upset, but it's like pushing that button. I'm like, yes, that's good. Like, I mean, it's like a nice thing for an evil mad scientist, I guess, to throw your way, but also, I don't know. And it's to this day, it's still clanging around in there. It's just one of those things that really just jump in my brain.
Well, that's two for consciousness separated from the world.
Control. There's very chilling, I think, about not being in control of your body and being seen. And I've written a couple stories where, like, you know, again, like kind of possession or body set, but you're still in your body, but you're not able to control it. And I find that idea very haunting. And I also find kind of the opposite of the jump scare very scary. And so things that I've written that have creeped me out are usually like that you look and you think you see something and you look back and it's gone. But I always find it much scarier. And occasionally I see this in movies and things where you look and then you look back and it's still there. And there's something so much creepier. And it's really common in a lot of Asian horror. The ghosts don't change, they just stand like, and they just watch you, and you can't make them go away, and you can't talk to them, and you can't do anything, and their presence is just this thing. And there's something I find so creepy about that, and just especially if it's tied to if you have a guilt about whoever this person is. And like the story I specifically wrote, she kind of blamed herself for this person's death. Just kind of watch her all the time, just nonstop, day in and day out. And she's fully kind of going crazy and never sleeps because there's just someone watching you all the time. And how they're not doing anything, but there's something so haunting. So I don't know. I think that's one of the more disturbing things I wrote.
So I have to say about the button thing, the button pushing thing is like all of our significant others push our buttons, but not.
That's true.
Go ahead, Bracken. Maybe okay, I don't know. Go ahead, John.
Whether it's book or in movie, you know, what there are things that I, you know, as someone who really likes to be scared, this is sort of a hard question, because there are things that are scary to me that I like and I welcome, and there are things that terrify me and cannot read and I cannot watch. And those would, similar to Bracken, anything really when I was like a kid or as a parent, you know, there are, I guess the clearest example I can give, there's a movie that I famously have said many times I really dislike, and that is the movie Hereditary. And there's just a certain scene, yeah, I know, it's so someone I'll watch terrifying, not Max, but that movie I barely could finish. And that's, to me, those sorts of things are terrifying. I think as far as something I've written, because I will not write those things myself, things that I write that I think are terrifying. I find nightmares to be, you know, really inspirational, but also really scary. And so in my most recent book, there are a lot of nightmare scenes that I think are, to me, really terrifying because they really existed in my brain, came from my brain. Nightmares I actually have.
So you're saying Hereditary is too scary for you?
For me.
Yeah. No, I love that because it's such a wonderful exploration of grief. Right. And grief like that terrifies me because it's so deeply permeating where chainsaw clowns don't do a thing for me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, that stuff. You know, actually the one that really gets me is I don't like environmental horror. I have a really hard time with it. And I think it's just, well, because we're living, honestly, it's too close. You know, like Skip Inspector to the bridge. Yeah, and that always bothered me because, you know, this idea that the water is totally poison and it's just
everywhere, and the air is poison, and there's no getting away from it. And there's something about that I don't, and my husband edited a documentary a few years ago about Love Canal, and then like the new generation of people that moved into Love Canal after it was rebranded, and they all had problems, and just the amount of research on how close we all are to Superfund sites, and pretty much all of us here, like most people are within a mile or 2 miles from one. Yeah, and most of them are where schools and public buildings are built because they sold the poison land for pennies on the dollar to the sports fields, to the towns. There's so disturbing about that I was like, I don't want to talk about it. Like,
New attorney, focus of civil action. Jan Schlickman, who brought the case against W.R. Grace for poisoning the water in Woburn, right? And they had
I'm from Woburn, it is Woburn.
Woburn. But you know what happened was the leather chemicals seeped into the groundwater, went into the aquifer, and then people would take showers and it would aerosolize these chemicals, and they got leukemia. And it's terrifying because you jump in the shower and you just assume that it's safe to shower.
It's a wild cabin fever for the gross water stuff. Because of that, like, and when that body is, when he falls into the water, but the idea of like poisoned water, it's something that really gets to me. And it's really, but it really grosses me out.
It's like a water world thing when you can actually. Anyways, thank you so much for this amazing panel discussion. Thank you all for your lots of questions. So we have a slight change